go ahead and get started. This session is Design Systems, Drupal, and Beautiful Synergy. If that's not what you're here for, then you're in the wrong room. Or we're in the wrong room, one or the other. Hope it's not us. My name is Larry Garfield. You may know me as Krell online. If you want to make fun of me on Twitter during the session, that's where you do so. I'm a senior architect with Palantir.net. We're a web development shop based in Chicago. We do mostly Drupal development, but not exclusively. We work mostly with education, cultural institutions, healthcare, publishing. Institutional nonprofits are kind of our mainstay. We do some corporate work as well. We've got some nice brochures and swag up here if you want later. For Drupal 8, I'm the web services lead. So those that have been tracking Drupal 8 development, you can blame me for about a third of all the things that changed out from underneath you. The Drupal representative to the PHP Framework Interoperability Group, advisor to the Drupal Association, and general purpose lovable pedant. My colleagues at Palantir will tell you the second half of that at least is definitely true. So yeah, I'm actually a back-end developer, not much of a front-end developer, definitely not a designer. So what am I doing here? Well, I'm here introducing.
I'm Patrick Grady, and I am a senior designer at Palantir.net. I sometimes work with Larry, and I am an aspiring gentleman of leisure.
Something to which we can all aspire.
So we're here to talk about design systems today. We believe that the key to beautiful synergy is to think systems, not pages. I just kind of leave that approach in the past. We're going to first take a look at what a design system is. Then we're going to kind of go through an example and give you guys some insight into how we might go about implementing or developing a system. And then finally, we're hoping to demonstrate that systems thinking can really be the common language between design and development. So, why design and systems? First of all, for consistency, both visual and in terms of content. Any good system can start to bring order to a set of stuff. And once you start bringing order to nothing, you've kind of started the design process. Next, efficiency. There's great gains to be had in efficiency if you work in systems. Basically, in terms of production, so you don't have to sit down and design a PSD for every page. Everybody knows that. But also in terms of responsive design. So you don't have to do multiple layouts as static comps as well. So, and then as your system develops, you also start to see, the more it starts to give back to you because the more parts and pieces you have to leverage and play with. Finally, sustainability. Your site's got a life after us. If it has a strong system at its core, then you're kind of giving it a good, opportunity to evolve over time, in a way that doesn't really, need you. So you're kind of setting it up for success after you've gone. So, what is a system? We'll start there. The definition of a system is a set of interconnected parts forming a complex whole. In terms of our discussion today, a design system can be composed of elements, components, and templates. Elements are, your most basic parts of any website. Headers, paragraph, anchors, lists, things of this nature. Next, we have components, which are basically things that are built by combining elements. So header, footer, navigation, hero element, calls to action. Finally, you put some components together, you arrange them on a page, and you make a template. Home page, landing page, listing page, things like that. This is basically atomic design, a simplified version of it anyway. You put these pieces together, you combine them, and you create larger things out of them until you get your site. So the other part of this definition is the complex whole, which for us is a CMS-driven site. And we're going to go ahead and take a look at a site we designed and developed about a year ago for PRI, Public Radio International. Public Radio International is basically like NPR. They develop and distribute public access content for the radio. They wanted a site that was modern, responsive, and basically a destination for people to come and consume, engage with, and share their content. So, I mean, that can be a pretty tall order, so it's kind of like, where do you begin? Well, you know, you start at the beginning. With any brand, it always kind of boils down to the basics, color being one of the most major ones. Then you might move on and start developing your elements. This is a good time to play with your type system. Get that running the way you want. Get your modular scale working. And just begin to show how the type system begins to develop. And then in this graph, you can kind of see a couple of overlaying samples that were shown to the client just to show headers, deck copy, body copy, lists. And then on the right, we have things like a link and some other basic styles that we might need because our site has a WYSIWYG editor. So that's really a good foundation point. Once your client is kind of bought into the color palette and the basic elements, you can really start to see a system start coming together. So after that, your next step is a vital one, and one that we talked about, or Steve talked about earlier in the keynote. Is getting to know your content. We can't emphasize this enough. This is kind of like the most important step. So in terms of PRI, it was a matter of asking, why are people coming to this site? Well, they're coming to this site to read stories. That's what we determined with the client together. And then we performed an exercise similar to the one that Steve showed us in his keynote, where you basically go through and say, these are all the things that are linked to this idea of what is a story. In terms of PRI, we had things like title, date, section, author, program, lead text, lead image, program sound clip, embedded content, comments, share controls, lots of things like that. Then, after you've kind of determined, okay, this is my set of things that I have to consider when I'm talking about the idea of a story, you can kind of go into this, the next area where you start to combine colors and elements and create components and sort of build up your first template to like this most core page of the site. If we go ahead and look at some visual examples, here's a story header, and it's composed of date, author, title, program, and section. This is kind of quick hit, high-level information that the user should be able to, get right away and understand where they're at and how they can maybe go about finding more similar content. Then if we look down a little bit, we might have something like an ad block. Is there a stylistic way to handle that? Next, lead image with a caption and credit. What does that look like? And I should say, this is a disclaimer. Like, these are fully finished, like, comps. The actual process involves a lot of sketching on the whiteboard, a lot of visual exploration. It doesn't come from nowhere. I'm just kind of skipping all the nitty-gritty and like getting to the more finished product. Then on the right, we have like a little share control widget. So here's the template as a whole, and you can see in green the components we just sort of talked about at the top. And you can see how you could just sort of keep repeating this process and keep adding to this story content type with all these important pieces of data that are associated with it. So the next step after you've got your sort of core content type is to spin out the system and make other templates. So you basically just repeat this process, keeping in mind all the stuff you learned before. Go back and analyze your content. If you're going to go from this point to making a homepage, you might go, why? Ask yourself that same question again. Why are people coming here for stories? So our homepage should be a page that offers a lot of various stories to the user. That should be its function first and foremost. So we have the same idea of the story again, but we're going to need like a more succinct, kind of distilled view of that story. So we might do an exercise where we boil down all the stuff that is usually associated with the story, and come up with this, smaller list, and that'll help us to describe a story without actually showing the whole thing. So it's a story item. So in this case, we have title, date, section, program, lead text, lead image, and share count. So we want our homepage to sort of show a lot of stories, but we don't want it to be boring, and we want to give a sense of hierarchy to the page so the user is directed in a nice way. So we're going to need kind of alternate views for stories. So here we have a story item as a lead feature, and you can see it's got like it's kind of a left and right layout with the image on the left, share count connected to that, and then on the right, your usual suspects of title and some metadata and lead text. So that's one way to view a story. Here's another way to represent a story, but it's in a more compact way. So it's basically, let's take all these things and maybe get rid of some of them so we can have an even more efficient view of a story. So it's got all the same stuff except we dropped the lead text now. So basically it just consists of title and image and metadata. Next, we might come up with an even more compact way to view a story, and so we might develop a compact illustrated list with a piece of metadata on the top, image, and then just the title. Here's another one, a normal illustrated list, except this one kind of is much bigger and expansive and includes more information than the last. Finally, we have like the most compact way to represent a story on a page is simply as a title, some metadata, and that's it. And maybe that gets used on a sidebar or for related content or something in your design later. So here we've got the home page, and we're just serving up a bunch of stories. But since we have all these varied ways to represent a story, you can see that we have something a little more interesting to look at than just a big list. So at the top, we've got our lead story item. Then underneath, we have a grid consisting of some ad spaces and some more stories. Underneath that, we have this component which consists of a bunch of compact list items. But these are built specifically to surface the newest story in each section. So the newest science story, the newest global politics story, etc. And then we have our just newest by chronological list underneath that, which is just there to basically make the site current. So the good news is we've got a couple of templates now, and it might seem kind of like a lot of work, but every time you do this exercise, it gets a little bit easier because the set of stuff you have to play with has grown. So in this case, we might, the team might have determined that, hey, you know what, we're going to need a list page too. And that's really no problem at all for the designer to be like, okay, no problem. I already got a list view for all these stories, so I'll just put those in the main content area. And I've also got this kind of smaller compact list already defined as well. And here you've sort of got a new page, and you've already got like 80% of it done.
So, Patrick, I have to ask, what am I doing here? I'm a Drupal developer. How does this relate to me in Drupal?
Well, so as I was describing this design system, Drupal is a content management system. So systems talking to systems should be good.
That sounds like a great idea. So let's go through the same exercise from the Drupal side. So, let's start with type and color, and that doesn't really affect Drupal at all, which is a good thing. Drupal doesn't enforce any kind of basic typography on you, which means you can design site-wide typography that will work across the entire site, across whatever layouts you have, across whatever screen sizes independently. And that frees up Patrick to work on the fonts and the typography and the color scheme and other things that I don't understand. I'm a developer. I can't actually tell the difference between most fonts, so I'm happy he can. And that doesn't affect me on the Drupal side at all. Where it does start to impact you is getting to know your content. As Patrick said, this is a critical first step for the design process. It's also a critical first step for Drupal, and really for any content management system. In the biz, as they say, this is referred to as content strategy. You've probably heard that term a lot more recently. And content strategy and design are closely linked because they're looking at the same question. What is the structure of my content? What is the structure of what it is I'm trying to say, what it is I'm trying to show, what it is I'm trying to share? And specifically, we're looking at content modeling or data modeling. What is the underlying structure of the information I am presenting? And Patrick talked about how that informs the design. It also informs how you put Drupal together. And when you put it together in Drupal, it looks very familiar. We've seen this list before because if you've done your design properly, this is going to line up very closely with Drupal itself, like 95%, in terms of the way Drupal wants to model content. Well-designed content models well in Drupal, and vice versa. The first step to capturing that effectively, in our experience, is what we call the build spec. This is a tool that we've developed at Palantir to help us plan out a site before we actually get into Drupal. Not just plan out the design, but plan out the content model. If you want, we do have this available online. And these slides will be available immediately after the session if you don't want to write things down. But if you want to play along at home, bit.ly Palantir build spec. And it is basically a giant spreadsheet because everything in content strategy ends up in spreadsheets. That's where content strategy happens. Oh well. But it's a place for us to map out, okay, from the content strategist and the designer have figured out this is the content we have, this is the model for it. How are we going to represent that in Drupal? Well, we're going to represent the body with a long text field on a node. We're going to represent our lead image as an image field, and that's going to have a limit of 1 value. And we map out all of the things we are going to be putting into the content configuration screens. Why do we do it here first? Because this is way easier to change as the design evolves. Patrick can be working on a design and show me early drafts of it. I can mock it up in a build spec like this in an hour and figure out, OK, here's how I would then structure that within Drupal. Oh, by the way, can we make this one little change, and then I don't need to write a custom field type for it? Patrick, that OK? Cool. All right, we've just saved ourselves 10 hours of development. I like this plan. And we can go through, like, does this field need to be plain text, or do we need a WYSIWYG on it? Talk with Patrick, talk with the content strategist, talk with the rest of the team, talk with the product owner. Get these questions sorted out early, and they can play into the design. And then we also map them into, it's a little hard to read here, our node types. So on this site, it's a very simple site. We had basic pages and stories. Most sites are going to have more content types than that, but in this case, we just had those two. And just, here's the fields that we've configured that we can use here, and then reuse on other content types if we want to. And again, the idea here is plan out what you're doing so that what you're doing in Drupal matches the design and vice versa. They play off each other. And then you go dump it into Drupal. And this is an afternoon's worth of work pushing buttons to set up your content types along the lines you just figured out. And so we've got our, our date, which is a date field. Module you add. Our section, we've decided that's going to be a term reference, so it's using taxonomy terms for that. Do you want those to be nodes or taxonomy terms? That goes back to how is it going to get used in the design? Hey, Patrick, are those going to be their own thing, or are they just metadata? Let's talk this out. Maybe, slightly different design, slightly different intent. We might have used a separate node type there for sections instead. You can have those conversations early. And so on and so on. Related content. All right, we're going to say that it's an entity reference pointing to other story nodes. You can have this conversation collaboratively early on. And then Drupal gives you your nice big edit form. You can jazz that up a bit using field groups if you want to, whatever else. But that happens independent of the design, because you're understanding your content influenced by but independent of the design you're displaying. Content is what drives the site. Content exists independent of the color scheme and the fonts and the layout. The content exists in an abstracted platonic form. And then we're just structuring it here and defining different ways that it will get displayed. So let's look at those. We're going to go create those components, those templates, just like we did in the design. We can now do those in Drupal. Component, as Patrick was talking about, is a visual representation of a piece of content. In Drupal, we have this tool called view modes. Visual representations of content are view modes. It's a way of presenting a node in a certain way. Which means components, design components are view modes, because design is commutative for the math geeks in the room. Nobody? OK. So let's start off. We had the story shown on its own page. What content is going to be shown there? What do we need? We configure that full view mode of in Drupal, and we say, all right, we need that date field. We're going to show into date format. We need the section. We want to make that a link or not. Just select all the fields we're going to show. Pick the formatter for each one. The formatters are roughly equivalent. They're a bit more abstract than elements, but they're roughly at the same level in the hierarchy within Drupal as the atomic elements that Patrick was talking about. And we can configure those in many cases. So like the lead image, in this case, we're going to show formatted to this size and not link it to anything. And it's all just button pushing. It gives us something that is a vague approximation of the design we want. The content is there. The content's all on the page, and it's all being populated dynamically. And now we want to make it actually look pretty. We want to actually match the visual design that we developed that gives the brand that we want. Once you have it in this nice structured form, all you have to do is theme the view mode. So themers in the room, I'm going to skip over the CSS and HTML you can do here. But you're editing one template file and the CSS that goes with it. You just need the one template file because you're just defining not the page, but this one chunk. So, you probably, I think in Drupal 7 you do need to add some theme hook suggestions, but you can very easily get a template file per view mode or per view mode per content type. And then a story node in full version, here's the template for it. That's all you have to modify. That's all you have to theme. And so, you've sprinkled your CSS skills on top of that, and you get that themed page we talked about before. Cool? Cool. So let's take that a step further. What's next? More components and more templates. Lather, rinse, repeat. First thing we're going to do here is, let's say we want to build out that illustrated list version that Patrick was talking about. So first, let's create an image style for it, because we want that same image shown in a different way, in a different size. Who's played with image styles in Drupal? Not the entire room. Anyone who doesn't have your hand up, you'll love these. Image styles are a way to filter and display an image. So the most common is we can scale it. So we want to take whatever the image is and scale it to 145 by 82 pixels. Patrick, why was it 145 by 82?
Because responsive.
Because responsive, there you go. And that's actually the size that we determined experimentally, scaled best from desktop to smaller size without us having to modify it. Uh-oh.
Aren't you just going to scale the image in the browser anyway?
If the image is 5,000 pixels to start with, we absolutely do not want to ship a 5,000 by 5,000 pixel image. We want to scale down to the largest we realistically want to display, and then let the browser scale it down from there. It's a valid point. You can.
Really fundamental question. So what unit or measure is that?
Pixels.
That's small? Wow, that's small.
Well, it's just a thumbnail image.
Yeah, this is a thumbnail. There's others that we can set up for, scaled down or up to 1,000 wide by whatever high and so forth.
You can tell I know this, but I'm just wondering, so if you start out with a thumbnail, and I kind of looked at this before, but where do you store the large image if you need to be able to scale it back up to a desktop?
So you upload the large image in Drupal. So on the node edit page, your content editor provides a photograph straight off their camera. It's this gigantic, 3 megabyte, 4 megapixel image. You're not going to show that whole image on your website. It's going to be larger than the entire rest of your page. But we can scale it down to show in a thumbnail at this size, have a different image style that scales it down to 400 wide to show, when it's the header image on its own page. Have another one that drops it down to 80 by 80 for a little thumbnail. It's all the same image, just being rendered to different sizes. You can apply other effects too, like you can scale, you can crop, you can play around with saturation, you can reduce something to grayscale. In practice, scaling is the one that I use most. I rarely use the others, but they're there if you want them.
I don't recall. I believe does it create a separate image?
Yeah.
That's what I thought. And it's important for people to know.
Yeah,
it
generates this image and caches it, so there's no performance overhead when people are actually viewing the site.
It always preserves the original image.
Yeah.
Create as many derived images as you want.
Right, but you don't want to just give a mobile user a gigantic image that happens to be like scaled, but not created as an actual new image, because then it's going to be slow.
So,
I was just wondering, can you use media queries to call up the different size images? I mean, how do you call up the different size images?
So this just ships the one image. So in this case, we're going to ship an image that is 145 pixels in size, period, and then apply max width to it. So when that shrinks down to a smaller screen, we're shrinking that down to 100 pixels wide or whatever. But that's starting from this base rather than the base of a 4 megapixel behemoth.
It's worth mentioning that the adaptive images module ties in with image styles, so it would allow you to deal with that if you needed to on the larger images by dynamically replace it with one that fits the size of the device that's requested.
I'm also happy to report the picture elements, which does all this stuff natively in HTML, just got into Chrome like last week. So it'll be in the next version of Chrome. That's developers and designers have been working on that one for like 3 years. It's amazing to finally see. I don't know if support for that is still in Drupal 8. It went in and out a couple of times. But so yeah,
Maybe you should make sure it's still there.
It is still there? Okay. The world of responsive images is still messy, but it is getting better. So Now that we've defined this render version of an image, we can do the same thing to the entire node, to the entire piece of content. In Drupal, in core, we have full and teaser are the only view modes you really get. There are a few others that no one uses, like search and so on. But there's a wonderful module called Entity View Mode that everyone should install, which lets you create custom view modes for any content type. So in this case, we're going to create a new view mode that applies to only nodes. It's called Illustrated List, and we only want to enable it on story nodes. Cool. Push the button, and then we can go configure. We have this Manage Display tab in Drupal, and we have this new Illustrated List view mode, this new design object of the story, and we're going to put on just a few fields. We just want section, date, image, and program, the exact list Patrick talked about before. And all these others, we're just going to hide completely. And in this case, we can also configure it so the image is going to be using that image style we just created. And in this case, we want the image to link to its content because it's not its own page. Helpful tip, images that are part of a content page should always link to that content page because that's what users are actually going to click on. They're not going to click on the title. They're going to click on the big image in front of them. Great. So now we have the ability to render stories in this alternate way, in this alternate view mode, in this alternate lens and filter into that content. What do we do with that? How do we actually show that on the site? Well, views. Who's played with views? Hopefully everybody? All right. Views is a designer tool. You never thought you'd hear me say that, did you? Views is a content assembly tool. It is a way for building business rules around what content you're going to pull out of your system and display. What content are you going to assemble to show? And that is incredibly powerful. It's one of Drupal's greatest strengths is that anyone, designers, developers, front-end developers, whoever, can just build these business rules to support a design. So I'm going to look at this quick video here. So by default, Views is going to load up fields, and you select the fields individually. But you can also say, I just want a whole piece of content. And I don't want the teaser version. I want the illustrated list that we just created. So I want to make a list of, and turn off the extra links. I want an illustrated list of stories. And now we don't have any fields, because it's already part of the template. Let's change the business rules. So let's say only show 5 items. Whatever, or 6 items. And now, we already have in here filtering for stories of content of type story that is published. We want to sort it by post dates, so newest first, just straight lists. Cool. We now can theme that, yeah?
So why content and not rendered entity?
Because I'm used to using content, rendered entity was added later, and I'm not quite sure what the difference is. Honestly, that's what it comes down to. But now we can theme that illustrated list view mode of a story the exact same way we themed the full version. It's one template in CSS to go with it, and you're done. And we can make it look like that. There's the fields fields we were talking about, just laid out in this way because the template says so. But then shown in a view on the home page shows up like that. Here's that illustrated list style in just newest first straight list. We can put that on that other section landing page as well. Exact same design, exact same component with a different view that has different rules. So it filters it by section as well, for example. Or you want to order it differently, or only want to get some subset of them. That's fine. They look the same. Visually, the design is identical. Not just it looks the same implementation under the hood. Same exact template, same exact CSS, same exact markup. Which means I can reorganize those. I can easily change the rules around it. I can throw together a new page. The client can just create a new page from whole cloth somewhere using that design. And it'll automatically look good. because we're still building on that system we designed in the first place. Drupal supports that kind of systematic design through the tools it provides, through view modes, through thinking of your content as lenses, these design components as lenses onto your content that you can then mix and match around the site. So this could be a view of the same content, just a different view mode. And this is a different view mode. I would probably build this entire page as panels with like 4 or 5 views in it. Maybe, if that's a series of separate views, maybe 8 views. But still, it's just the same content object being displayed in predefined ways. And if the client wants to change it, say, I don't want this piece anymore. Or, oh, wait, I want to show most recent content in this style instead. Because we've themed it at that view mode level, it just works. I throw a new view in here that's showing the top item from each section using this view mode instead. Poof, I get that style, and everything formats nicely. Everything looks good. Because we're leveraging the system, not this Photoshop comp. That's where you really get the power of design systems in Drupal, where Drupal will support the design system you have. In summary, Drupal is a very designer-friendly CMS. You probably have never heard someone say that before. What's that? But if you're thinking in design systems, Drupal is a very friendly CMS. If you're thinking in Photoshop comps, Drupal is going to fight you every step of the way. So don't think in Photoshop comps, think in design systems, because that's with the grain. A design systems-based design is a Drupal-friendly design. You want Drupal-friendly designs? Design in systems. They work for Drupal, they work for responsive, they work for surviving past you. The most important step to getting there is understand your content. I'm going to repeat this over and over again. Understand your content in the abstract. You want to understand your content independent of Drupal, independent of a particular page. The content exists in the kind of platonic form. There's more detail on that, a blog post I had just recently. The content exists kind of in the ether as this object. And you're just designing these windows onto it, this illustrated list window onto it, this full-page window onto it, this compact list window onto it, that you can then mix and match to build the pages you want. And you can mix and match, developers can mix and match, the client can mix and match, and it's all still going to follow the same design vision that you had in the first place because you built a system for it rather than a pretty picture. If you find yourself, with a design that's really hard to put into Drupal, there's a good chance it's because you don't have a good working system. You haven't thought through all of the parts of content displayed in different ways. If you find that it's really easy to do, then cool, you probably did it right. If you have a design element you're trying to include and you just can't get it to fit in the system in some way, you probably don't need it. That's a good way to filter out extraneous cruft you don't need in a design is, can I fit this into that system of content displayed some way? I can have as many different ways as I want off that same content, but if I can't fit this widget or this thingy into my design following that systemic thinking, it's a good sign it doesn't belong there in the first place. Just because some executive said we want this thingy on the page doesn't mean he's actually right. If it doesn't fit the system, then it doesn't fit. It's going to be jarring for the user as well as the content editors. Just because a page looks pretty, someone was talking about this yesterday, just because it looks pretty doesn't make it a system. A good system is beautiful, is attractive because of the patterns in it, because of the consistency to it. And that makes it beautiful, that makes it sustainable, that makes it consistent, that makes it easy to implement. Quite simply, a system is a system is a system. Systems are a good thing. Patterns are a good thing. And you want to use the same system across your project. Your designers, your developers, your engineers, the client should all be working in the same system throughout. If you're working in different systems, you're going to bang into each other and collide and swear at each other, and you don't like doing that. You want to be able to collaborate, because you get a good system when the designers and the developers are defining it together and collaborating and saying, here's the content we have, here's the design we want to apply to that, here's the design system to build around that, and now we can model that in Drupal really, really easily. Thank you. Again, we're with Palantir.net. Look us up online. You can stalk us on Twitter and see where we're presenting next. I'm actually giving this talk again at Twin Cities Drupal Camp next weekend. We do have a newsletter. It's very low volume, I swear, but it does keep track of this kind of thinking that we put out. And I've already put these slides online. If you want, we'll be tweeting them later as well, with all the links in it to further resources. Questions?
Do you have any quick tips on responsiveness? How do you take that site we just saw and make it responsive?
That site we just saw is responsive.
Well, I mean, like, where do you define, your breakpoints and,
Well, I think that's a different talk. But I mean, we do all our stuff responsively. We don't have another way to do it. So it's just the way that we do it. How we decide when to shift from one layout to the other is usually based on, hey, this looks like crap. We need to change it. Sometimes some people have said like, oh, maybe try to optimize certain views at certain areas. You can do it that way too, but I think it's a lot simpler when you just start from the mobile viewpoint first, always, and you stretch it till it breaks, and then you change it.
I think another important factor there, Steve was talking this morning in his keynote about, if you design your site in these huge chunks of header, content, sidebar, you're going to lose a lot when you try and make it responsive, when you try and scale it down. If you think of each design component as the chunks you can rearrange, you get a lot more flexibility to say, all right, when this thing shrinks down, then this component moves over here, and this component moves over here. This component on its own, here's the responsive logic for an illustrated list, and here's what it's going to do. Here's where the breakpoint at which the text is going to drop below the image, which could be completely different than the compact illustrated list, what it does. It can work at a different breakpoint. That's fine. And you can change the overall layout at a different size. So you don't have to have desktop, tablet, and mobile. You can have each of these individual components does its own thing at the size that makes sense for it. And so you don't have 3 site designs. You have one site design that flexes cleanly.
There's an interesting way of going about that I've read about from Jeremy Keith, and it's sort of taking those atoms of content, putting them all in an unrestricted page, and just keep moving that in and out so that each of those views of that content will work no matter what width it's placed in. And that way, if you have 4 different views of like teasers and that full article, put each of them in succession on the page and then work out the CSS for those, so that way you don't really have to care what the eventual breakpoints are in the design. You know that each of those elements will work no matter where you place it.
Patrick, didn't you have a blog post like a year and a half ago about breaking where it's logical rather than its big chunks?
Yeah, but that's like kind of a different idea.
Thought about it.
Yeah, I mean, this basically just will make the code more resilient, and that way then you can make design decisions about how you want to use them and where you want to place them, and know that the elements are just going to work.
Well, kind of along those lines, as a added benefit for designers, if anybody's interested in doing style guides, web style guides, parsing up these components and displaying them in terms of the visual style guide that's online is kind of like a logical progression. We do it at Palantir. We like to do it when we have the time to do it. But since it's a system, it ports easily. Yeah.
So, responsive layouts are one thing, but what about, adapting content from a small device to a large device, adding adding new content to the page and changing the layout of your component after it's designed to be responsive as well. So maybe your teaser gets longer, or your image size updates, or the layout itself updates at a larger breakpoint. How are you doing things like that, or how are you approaching that?
Yeah, these components can change completely at different viewports. So the design team at Palantir actually writes the SAS for these components, and so that way we're doing that design thinking as we're developing the design system, and then it gets Drupalized. So having control over that, to normalize and actually writing code for this component allows us to hedge our bets on that stuff.
Good. What about adaptive content? I mean, are you adding things or subtracting things to the page at different breakpoints?
We try, our best practice, go-to is, try not to change what you're allowing your users to see. Figure out what that core, that same exercise of figuring out what your core experience is, and then going from there. And then, if you have, then it makes sense if you have a large desktop layout to add a few, little whiz bangs and interesting stuff. That's totally kosher.
I think there are hands over here.
This is probably different from how you do it because you have in-house design. But where I work, we work with other shops to do the design. And I would love to have a document that I could give them and say, this is information I need from you.
You and me both. Yeah, and
because I would love to have all right, what are all your image styles? Tell me, because I don't want to go through and measure all the images and
yeah. So at Palantir, we offer full service, but we do have a lot of clients who come to us with a design already made, either from an in-house designer or from some other design firm. And I pretty much always have the experience of going, wouldn't you just hire our team? They know what they're doing. Because I don't have that problem when I deal with our design team.
We've asked for outside design firms to supply a style guide, and if they're going to do that, so sometimes it might be a function of we don't have enough money to, the client might have enough money to ask them to do that, so then there's it's clear that there's this kind of void that needs to be filled, so it's either ask Palantir to do it or have, go back to the original design team and have them.
I've gotten style guides too, really long ones that don't give me information.
A large part of discovery for us when we've got an outside design firm is taking the Photoshop comps they gave us and breaking it down and analyzing it and saying, all right, so they've got this and they've got this, and this piece here and this piece here, they look the same. Let's check and make sure they are. Okay, now let's reverse engineer that to content. And now we can build a build spec off of that and build our view modes off of that. It's annoying. Unfortunately, we've had the experience of getting good at that, I'm sorry to say. But yeah, that is a totally separate skill of taking a comp-based site rather than a system-based site and reverse engineering a system from it. And that's something that our front-end team has gotten very good at over the years. And we usually have to go back to the client and say, so we're going to have to make these slight changes, or we're going to have to make these assumptions in order to make this even work. And that's where we run into problems of, oh, Drupal is so hard to design for. Well, no, Photoshop is hard to design web stuff for, and we have to bridge that gap. So if you bridge that gap at the design level, rather than at the Drupal level, everything becomes easier. I think they're recording this session, so feel free to point your clients at the video of this session too if you want.
I'd like to vote for a talk on what you just talked about, another separate session on that.
The reverse engineering part?
Yeah, next year.
I think actually Emma Jane Westbeek has a session she does on that. I don't know if she's done it recently, but she has done a PSD to Drupal talk and training. I've only seen an early version of it myself once, but it's, given a design, let's break it down and reverse engineer it into Drupal. So there is material out there for that. I haven't given that talk before, but we're hardly the only shop that does that.
Oftentimes, building a quick responsive prototype page is a very quick way to be able to go back and illustrate where those gaps are. Better if you can do it at the wireframe stage before they've gone in and done the full design. and it's easier and quicker to do there, but that actually might help get you into the conversation earlier so that you can help head these things off if you have a designer or a design firm that's not experienced with responsive design.
And it also helps that design firm, when you give it back to them, to realize how they can learn their medium of what they're actually designing.
You need to demonstrate the benefit. Yeah.
So earlier you mentioned if there's some necessary elements that added to the site and your client is really attached to that, element, so how do you talk it out of it?
Sometimes we can't. Usually it comes down to asking the question why, what does this do, where does this go? The most common thing I do in discovery meetings when we have a design that's just given to us before we arrive is going through it and saying, this link, what does it do, where does it go? What does this link to? 2/3 of the time, the client can't answer, and the designer can't answer. That's a sign that you need to pause, think through, all right, there's more stuff here that's hidden. This hidden stuff is additional extra cost. Are you sure you want to spend the money for us to figure out what this link is supposed to do? Sometimes the client will say yes, sometimes no. But just getting back to that, understand content and asking why. So what purpose does this serve? It'd be great, sometimes the answer is the purpose this serves is making this other exec happy. I would love it if clients were honest when that was the reason, because then I could just hack something in to make the other exec happy. If that's the answer, that's a why that you have to deal with, unfortunately. But getting to that why, and sometimes asking why, what purpose does this serve, we'll get to the point of, yeah, I guess we don't need that. Not always, but just holding on that understand your content and what purpose does it serve set of questions can help drive that as far as you're going to be able to go with it.
I guess this is kind of going back to the question of design deliverables. It sounds like your internal workflow works because your designers actually create the CSS. So is there anything else that's passed over? I mean, like, how are you documenting what are the image styles that you need to create, or any other, you have that document for the, I forget what it's called, the content types. But do you have any way of documenting, like, how are you setting up your actual display styles, or is that something the designers are actually doing?
BuildSpec actually does have tabs for that. It's actually a much larger document than I showed. So we do map out view modes, we map out image styles, and capture all of this stuff. Basically anything that you would push a button for, we capture beforehand in that. So that's one way that we can do it. Patrick, is there other handoff that happens there?
Yeah, I was going to say, some of that stuff is just like documented in the code. So the front-end developer and the engineers will just kind of do that function. We don't document anything extra, but we're giving them fully responsive prototypes.
Yeah.
So they have a lot to work with. They can actually go in and get like the actual values for this, widget, and I don't have to tell them because it's in the code.
So yeah, it seems like that would be the sort of the quick answer to say, like, how do you get outside designers to give you something that's useful is you ask them for fully responsive prototypes and to fill out the build spec sheet. And then
if you can find an outside designer to do that, that would be really good.
Yeah.
So when you've got these comps and style guides from outside design firms, how do you vet the interaction design? Because you can't hover over a comp and actually see what happens.
Yeah, we actually are working with a client now, like a world news organization, and they had an outside small design firm, and they had already dumped a year into this project and basically asked us to come on to sort of save it because it was stalling. And we were like, unfortunately, we're stuck with this design. So, I mean, this was the nightmare. They gave us like 100 million Photoshop files, and And we were like...
That's only a slight exaggeration.
It's over 150. And they had no system. Things were just changing willy-nilly because it looked cool. We asked them, basically what we had to do was ask them, we were like push it up, push it back and say, we need you to redline these and make notation and tell us exactly how this stuff works. And so then they came back with another set that had notes, and they would say like, oh, we saw this effect on this other site, can we do that? So it's still ongoing and it's tedious as hell.
So you basically take that comp and you run through it, make a prototype out of it, and then demonstrate the interaction as you perceive it, and then wait for them to approve it.
Yep.
Okay.
A lot of things people just don't understand it until they see it and can touch it and feel it and taste it. So if you think something is going to suck, do enough of it so that they can see how bad it tastes, and then they'll try to change the recipe. Hopefully.
Yeah.
Do you find that Photoshop is appropriate at any time, or are you staying clear?
Absolutely, yeah. So I actually did another talk about our entire process, and I skipped over that stuff for this particular one because we're honing in on the design system. But you know, we have the initial exploration happens at the beginning of the project, and you know, it's basically just use whatever tool you're fastest and most efficient in. It's different for every designer, I think, and it really doesn't matter what that is, because we're doing prototypes. So
you go from Photoshop, your initial discovery phase.
yeah, you might do some just visual exploration, like loosely, and not really think about a particular page. Maybe you have like a design problem to solve with the navigation and the header and how it works, and maybe you know, just looking at it as a designer, knowing where you have to get to kind of makes some educated guesses on like, maybe I'll whip up a comp of this and see if that gets me a blessing to continue, you know.
Dan Rose has done some really good talks about that, about where Photoshop sits in the design process. And a lot of times he recommends just sort of a back and forth sort of approach. You might start there and then go to a prototype and then snapshot that to try and bring it into Photoshop and work out another little problem and go back into code. I mean, it's a sketching tool. I mean, a lot of designers just think of that, so you just have to find the right place for it.
Just curious, how many filterable tags do you have on each of the stories on this site?
Filterable tags?
Well, like, you know, how many ways can they be sorted and filtered based on the metadata tags?
That particular site, I'm not sure.
We have sections, and which is basically those like science, politics program. So with PRI, you know, all the content is a radio story coming from an actual radio program. So the takeaway,
BBC World, This American Life, various others.
So there's multiple ways you can, there's a little component to that site. If that's the way you want to browse that content, you can do it through the program. But the aim of the homepage was to provide a sort of experience that's partially curated by other editors, like more like a newspaper, you know. So there is multiple ways to go about navigating that content on the site. Yeah.
So this is awesome.
Thanks.
Our front-end people are totally on board with atomic design. We actually use the Palantir spec on the Drupal side. The missing piece is that our front-end people, our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript people are not beginners, so they don't understand the template system, and they don't want to understand the template system. How do you guys approach that?
Our themers all understand the template system and get quite good at it.
Our designers are partly, I think, in that front-end category, and our front-end developers are part site builders, themers, and so it's just kind of like those lines in the sand have just kind of shifted a little bit.
I think there's also a point to be made. You know, if you have to understand your medium, Drupal is part of your medium. If you don't actually want to learn anything about Drupal's front end, you're not going to be able to work with it. So
Yeah.
Front-end developers who refuse to learn Drupal will be poor front-end developers. I'm just going to go on the record and say that.
So when Palantir rips apart a comp and prototypes it, you're prototyping the Drupal markup in mind already, right? Like the wrappers and maybe some of the templates?
That's actually part of the function of the front-end developers. So the designers just do like HTML5 markup.
I think
if the developers know like, hey, I can't use that markup, but it's kind of their world to sort of improve.
I think we're out of time. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, everybody. Yes, welcome.